Folks, welcome to today's Priest Brownbag. My name is Bart Redford. I want to, on behalf of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, I want to welcome you here today. If this is the first time you've been, we do this every Tuesday at noon. From noon to 1, we have a brown bag on some topic that's related to our area. And you're welcome, of course, to bring in, it's exactly what it says it is, a brown bag, so bring your lunch. If you want a lunch while we listen to what the speaker has to say. We've got a lot of exciting topics, a variety of issues lined up for you for the fall, so we'd love to see you back. If you're interested, if you missed one, we have a YouTube channel where we post all of our brown bag talks if the speaker allows us to videotape it, or tape it at least, and we'll post it. And then also we've got sign-up lists over on the table over here, as well as information about our activities. If you haven't seen sort of our lineup for this fall, be sure to grab one of our event listings over there. Speaking of events, other things that are going on this week, on Thursday, evidently the Dole Center has organized a whole series on decisive battles. And this Thursday evidently is devoted to the battle for Moscow. I'm not quite sure who the speaker is, but that's going to be from 3 to 4 at the Dole Institute. And then on Friday, September 5th, I'd invite you to join us as we sort of celebrate the beginning of the semester. We have a fall mixer, allows us to sort of get to know our new students, new faculty, and that's going to be from 5 to 8 over at the Information Center, the old training depot. So, our speaker today is Dr. Kipp, who is adjunct professor of history here at University of Kansas. Jake is a longtime supporter and friend to Priest. He's helped to not only done a lot of talks for us, but also helped bring in speakers and supported the center in a lot of different ways. He is retired, but continues to write columns on security issues for organizations like the Jamestown Foundation, and speaks at conferences and so on. He retired from federal service in 2009, but worked for as an analyst and a teacher for many years at Fort Leavenworth. From 2003 to 2006, he was director of the Foreign Military Studies Office, and we're all familiar with their work. But also after that, switched over and worked with the School of Advanced Military Studies. He's published extensively on Russia and Soviet military history and military history in general. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jake to talk about what's going on in Ukraine.
Okay. This talk today is a preview of a talk I'm supposed to give down at the University of North Carolina at a conference sponsored by the University of North Carolina and the University of Torino in Italy. And the topic is the EU. It's a larger theme. And when I agreed to speak a year ago on Russia and the EU, I quite frankly figured I had a fairly easy topic to deal with. The context has changed. And the point I'm going to make today, which I will make in that talk, and it's a salient one, is that what has happened in Ukraine from November 2013 down to the present has in fact led to the destruction of what was the post-Cold War order, international system. When I say that, you can ask me the question, how many of you are political science majors? Okay. None of you. Oh, well, there's more of that. Well, historians and political scientists look at international relations. We tend to see systems organized around major events. They come into existence. They are maintained by a certain entropy in the system, and then they enter into crisis and collapse. The long view of things is that since about 1648, we've had an international order that was based on nation states. And nation states were the dominant edifice inside them, and it was an inherently Eurocentric notion of relations among the states. The modern world, which I'll just take a couple points out here to see the background and what we're talking about. The modern European system usually dates from 1815, something called the Congress of Vienna. It's at the end of 20 years of war and revolution, and it's essentially an agreement of the victorious powers to get together with France and say, okay, we're going to now create a system, a concert, which will guarantee that we don't have revolutions and disturbances in the international order. Henry Kissinger's first most important book was on Vienna and the role of Metternich in it. The system lasts from 1815 to 1848, and it collapses with a revolution, actually a series of revolutions across Europe, where the governments are swept out of power, new arrangements come to power, and new coalitions of powers essentially emerge. This period of transformation is about 1848 to 1856, when the system is replaced with what's called the Crimean, post-Crimean system, dictated by the Treaty of Paris. It rests upon a defeat of Russia and Russia's claims to reorganize the Balkans. It rests upon an alliance between two unlikely partners, England and France. If you know the modern history of England and France, you could usually count on them down to this time to be on different sides. Well, that system didn't last long because, in fact, England and France did not have compatible interests. They were unwilling to support each other, either in the continent or abroad. And a Prussian, very smart fellow, by the name of Otto von Bismarck, knew exactly how to win the Russians over to be an ally and put a continental power, in fact, behind a rising Prussia. And so the Crimean system collapses, lists 1856 to 1870, collapses with Bismarck's last and final war, the war with France, and a system dominated by Bismarck, we call it the Bismarckian system, emerged. And existed for 20 years on an extraordinarily sophisticated balance of power, with Germany at the center of it, and Germany able to play essentially honest broker in a whole range of questions outside Central Europe, with Germany's primary concern. That system collapsed when a Kaiser decided that Bismarck was too old and he was going to simplify relations. The system that came into existence in 1891 was dominated by military alliances which now become firmly entrenched. Everyone is preparing for what they expect to be the Great War. Now they end up with the next 20 years fighting a whole bunch of local wars, but the system in Europe is one that literally locks everything in position. And when the mechanisms that held it in check break, you then get a general European war. That era, which we call the Belle Epoque, collapses in 1914 with a humongous, massive war, which for the first time is in fact going to call into question the ability of the balance of power to manage European relations. How does it call it into question? Well, the deciding force entering the war at the end is not a European power. It's the United States. So from this point on, the European balance of power will be part of a global system of security, recognized or unrecognized. In the post-war period, the Versailles system is based upon basically excluding two powers from the international system. One is Germany, and the other is the Soviet Union. Germany is excluded because of its quote-unquote responsibility for World War I, which the victors imposed upon it, with the Treaty of Versailles. And the Soviet Union is exploded because, quite frankly, they are the revolutionary power. They are intent upon transforming not just the international system of states, but indeed the very nature of states. And this system continues to exist between 1919 and 1939, when it absolutely, completely, and totally collapses with the Second World War. That war, in its horrendous nature, with its Asiatic side, which starts a little earlier, in terms of Japanese aggression, and the situation in Europe, very quickly very, very quickly, leads to the emergence of two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, and a post-war era, which some of us grew up with to think of as inherently the order of things, because it survived so long. How long did it survive? Well, you could say 1945 to 1989, or you can say 1945 to 1991. Pick either the Velvet Revolution as the deciding thing, emancipation of Eastern Europe, or pick the collapse of the Soviet Union as the end of the Cold War era. The important thing about this is that a particular transformation in weapons technology made this particular order particularly stable. And that technology was nuclear weapons. And the capacity of the two superpowers to have such huge arsenals in such huge numbers that the weapons themselves had become only a means of deterrence. It was inconceivable for either state to talk about the use of them because of all the other destruction that would follow out of the general decision to engage. NATO had a plan for tactical use of nuclear weapons, but the general problem was one of linkage, which would quickly lead to strategic exchange. The new system that emerged, the one you've lived under, let's see, how many of you were born after 1991? Da-da-da-da. Yeah, this is the order that you know. The capital reality of it is the predominant position of the United States. The original definitions of this new order were extraordinarily optimistic. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book, The End of History. At the end of the ideological conflict with the Soviet Union meant we would get back to a natural order, an order based on agreed values. In fact, one of the things about the system that emerges, people talk about an international relations based upon shared values. And that what was emerging was an order in which democratic states did not fight with democratic states, and therefore general war was not perceived of to be a possibility. What you had were management problems on the peripheries of order, on the peripheries of the established order. And these could be managed because, quite frankly, everybody came under the Pax Americana, even Russia. Russia was considered to be part of it, and the hope was that the Russian transformation would lead to the emergence of a state that was inherently Western, liberal civil society and would look like Des Moines. It's an old American hope. Doesn't usually work out that way, but it was the hope. Now, why do I see this event now, this, we'll call it what it is, Revolution and Civil War? Why would I see this particular event in this particular place a fundamental challenge to the post-Cold War order? Well, Zbigniew Brzezinski said it best back in 1991. He saw the post-Cold War order emerging, and he said the independence of Ukraine is the guarantee against any Russian attempt to reestablish an empire. And therefore, the independence of Ukraine was absolutely vital to the international system that was emerging. Now, that statement was made, but please note that for the next 25 years, Ukraine fell into a limbo. There are two great transforming movements going over Europe. One which was early seen as such was the EU after the Maastricht Treaty. It would not only fundamentally transform its internal relations, get a common currency, get central bank coordination in managing that edifice, but it would also expand to include more and more capitals as these other states recognize the EU as the engine of European economic development. That rosy picture continues to exist down to 2008. And then the Great Recession hits, and suddenly there are fundamental questions about whether the EU is the engine of economic stability that it was so presented as, and whether there were all shared interests among all the members. Great prosperity hid fundamental divisions inside the EU states as to how they approached their own reserves and currency, their own development, how they managed their deficits, which some of them didn't. But from 2008 on, the EU, which was seen as an engine of economic stability and with that security for Europe, called into question. The second great transforming phenomenon was the decision made to expand NATO. Now, please note, NATO expansion goes in a set of stages. The first stage involves 3 states in Central Europe. 3 states which had a long political history, which had, in terms of the experience with Soviet power, being inside the bloc, essentially each a history of autonomous civil societies having some element of development. In Hungary, it's goulash communism. After 1956, there's a recognition that there must be some element of concession to the Hungarian population. The same is true in Poland, with the Gomulka reforms, etc. And even the Czech and Slovakia. Slovakia makes less change, but Bohemia is moving in the direction of civil society. So what NATO does when it expands the first time is bring in states that are relatively easily compatible with NATO values. Those states make the transition between 1994, when NATO creates the Partnership for Peace, and 1999, to celebrate NATO's 50th anniversary. Now, in celebrating the anniversary, there was one interesting point that kept coming up. Because old NATO existed to do what? Keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. Well, after the Cold War's over, there's not really a problem with keeping the Americans in, because the Americans dominate the international system. We're going to play. What role we play is quite unclear. Its manifestation, I think, in terms of European security, is most clearly evident in the final decision by the Clinton administration to intervene in the Balkans under a NATO mandate. Germany down? No. There's no more any Germany down. A unified Germany, as Joseph Joffre said, once Germany is united, all things are possible. So Germany is going to try to find a new role for itself. And are we trying to keep the Russians out? Well, the original notion was no. That because Russia was supposed to evolve in a certain direction, to get a civil society, to get a market economy, to become an ordinary state, then NATO would have a special relationship with Russia. It created a council originally to do that. Ultimately, it creates, after 2000, a partnership agreement, the NATO Council, NATO-Russia Council. It does the same thing with Ukraine. But what I want to make clear is, by the late 1990s, nobody is talking about Russia becoming a NATO member. And the crisis there is one, an economic one in 1998, in which Russia looks like essentially its experiment has failed economically. And two, a fundamental Russian dispute with NATO over the use of military force to impose a settlement upon Yugoslavia, particularly in Kosovo, and an air campaign to do that. So Russia is now not going to get into NATO, but it's not to be perceived as an enemy either. And therein lies the problem, because in 1999, at its celebration, while Kosovo was going on, NATO said we're going to bring in a whole lot of other states. Some of these, Bulgaria and Romania, Slovakia, they look like, well, unfinished business from Eastern Europe. Okay. But there are 3 states which raise peculiar problems. These 3 states, probably because of their social organization, the extent of their civil societies, their clear orientation towards the West, all are natural NATO members. I'm talking the Baltic states. But there's a problem. All 3 of these states contain Russian minorities. And all 3 of these states are fundamentally concerned about what this Russian minority means in terms of their own internal stability. And so you end up with each of the states following different regimes to essentially say you can only become a citizen if you do certain things. And NATO membership here is designed to guarantee security, but the fundamental security challenge for these states is, in fact, inside their own population. And NATO offers these states a very curious solution to their security problems. These states are going to be secure as they learn to have armies that will support NATO out-of-area operations. Indeed, NATO sells this as a fundamental way for the non-member states to build a special relationship with NATO. And very quickly, it goes from peacekeeping, which is what they were doing in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. Under the Bush administration, it becomes peace enforcement operations in places like Afghanistan. And then unilaterally, not NATO, but with us, the idea that sending contingents to serve in Iraq was a guarantee of security. What you've fundamentally done is changed what NATO is about in terms of its center of gravity. It's moved east. And changed its orientation from a defensive alliance to a security manager. It is expected to be the organization of first result to solve international security problems. Please note, early on, the Russians bought into this. They bought into it, in fact, in Bosnia. There was a Russian brigade serving in Bosnia under an American division commander. But after Kosovo, the Russians say, no, 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 no. If you're going to do interventions, you're going to have to go through the United Nations. At that point, the security system, the one that's emerging on the NATO side and the one that's on the Russian side, are in collision courses. And the most violent collision happens in 2008, when a state which wanted to be a NATO member, whose government had pitched its security upon becoming a NATO member, finds itself confronted by Bucharest by, well, thank you very much, but you're not going to get a membership action plan. And the government of Georgia decided at that moment that it had to resolve its chief internal problem. Let's make sure we understand. Internal problem. because the Georgian state believed that Abkhazia and South Ossetia were provinces of Georgia which were essentially autonomous because of foreign peacekeepers preventing a resolution of the conflict, of the frozen conflict there. And they could look at other frozen conflicts like Moldova and say, or Nagorno-Karabakh, and say, we don't want that. And so the Georgians went to war and they got beaten by the Russians. Were they provoked into it? To a certain extent, yes. But the provocation was not just the Russians. It was also the NATO refusal to give them the security plan, because it left them in a security limbo and made the government of Georgia say, we have to do something. And the outcome was the lowest point of relations between the United States, at least, and Russia in the fall of 2008. Anybody remember that period? When Senator McCain suggested we were all Georgians? Didn't go quite as well as JFK saying we were all Berliners. But that was a level of feeling about the situation. And then after the election, suddenly it appeared that, well, Georgia wasn't that important. The Obama administration said, no, we're going to go back and do reset. We're going to find some ground. And what was the ground that we found to cooperate on? It's an important point here. What was the chief area of the reset with Russia? Nukes. Strategic nuclear weapons. Both sides could agree to cut their arsenals. Certainly the amount of money it saves. The Russians were engaged in a strategic modernization. It made sense to them. But it was the only area. When the United States went further and said, let's cut tactical nuclear weapons, the Russians smiled very nicely and said, no, we have other security problems where they matter. And the Russians were investing in a very short range but very sophisticated system called the Iskander. Supposedly limited to 300 miles. We now have a question of whether it is in fact limited to 300 miles. There may be a version around that has a hypersonic cruise missile that sits on the top of it and has a range of about 3,000 miles. But that's a debate and discussion issue which we entered into basically last January and have now raised again as an issue in May. The status of the INS, the Intermediate Forces Nuclear Agreement in Europe. Ukraine doesn't enter in here at all. Why doesn't Ukraine enter into it? Well, because Ukraine, essentially in its politics, had ended up domestically with, in fact, a balancing act between East and West. The history of Ukraine is not the history of one land. The history of Ukraine is very different in the East than from the West. Western Ukrainians had a very short experience with the Soviet Union. They were much more tied with Poland and with the Austro-Hungarian Empire than they were with the Russian experience, the Dnieper being the fundamental dividing line originally. But the politics, you could look at the election of 1994 in Ukraine and you would see that the divisions were between the South, and you could look at that as an ethnic frontier, and some people did. But the truth is, it wasn't just ethnic. It was also sociological and economic. Because that area in the southeast is the industrial heartland. It is the place, Kirovy Rog, Donbass, these are mining centers, these are steel producing centers. And their population is, use that nasty word, proletarian. Old Soviet Union, was that a good word? Yes. These were the salt of the earth. These are the people who worked. They were the ones who produced. Ukrainians from the center and west tend to look at them as not exactly the leading citizens of the country. And so you had a natural political division, and when there was, and this is a word that in Russian is, puts red in front of your eyes, a colored revolution. this case orange, bringing to power a man who was clearly opposed to Russian influence, by his own reasons to both distrust the ruling class in Ukraine and Russian sponsors, it looked at that particular point in time as if Ukraine would lean west. In fact, however, and let's make this very clear, while there was a fundamental dividing line in socioeconomics here, and you could make it an ethnic frontier, the reality of politics and order in Ukraine was largely set by oligarchic relations, by the process of privatization and the emerging power of oligarchs, essentially to make their own deals. And those were opportunities for corruption, which was not unique to Ukraine. If one goes back to the pre-Putin era in dear old Mother Russia, one finds a great deal of corruption among the oligarchs. Most of it for economic gain, but also having a political content. Mr. Berezovsky, who died last year, at one point was accused of giving $2 million to Shamil Basayev, one we know as a terrorist in Chechnya, as part of a game of destabilizing the Chechen government. And Basayev said, "That's a lie, he only gave me $1 million." Those were the kind of games that were played among an elite in the Russian case. In the Ukrainian case, the essential continuing disputes among the oligarchs froze what was supposed to be a revolution leading to a civil society. Many of the supporters who were in Maidan those first years became thoroughly disillusioned. They saw themselves as there was no change, change without change. And it is this context of frustration which, after Yanukovych is elected in 2010 as president, he, by the way, did not become president because the Orange Revolution said his first election was rigged. It was put aside. Now he's president, and to be honest with you, this was fair time for oligarchs, including his own family, etc., enriching themselves. It is in this context that the EU makes a proposal for an associateship agreement. One that would say Ukraine is now going to orient its economy towards the West. Now let me make clear, there are winners and there are losers in this. Let me explain to you who the winners are. They're the young, beginnings of a middle class, technocrats in the West who will in fact find opportunities for their talents. If they can get into the EU, whether as labor or as a competitor, they're going to do fairly well. Who's not going to do well in this new system? Let's lay it out right off. The East isn't, because their industries are rust belts. This is the Appalachia, Toledo, Cleveland core. These are enterprises that would demand massive modernization. I remember Erickson from Columbia, we were discussing the fate of Magnitogorsk, analogous city in Russia. And the point of departure was that a city of 500,000 people, to be made into an actually viable economic community, would have to go from 500,000 to 100,000. And most of the people there would be involved in environmental cleanup. Magnitogorsk was a city where kids at mid-morning break got oxygen. Think about that one. These kind of areas where the industry is obsolete, where the mining is deep and the seams are small, they sell their product to the East. They have a Russian market. Indian firms come in and bought part of the large steel complex down in Mariupol, but the point is it's still largely a Russian market. The other big losers, let's make this one very clear, are Ukrainian defense industries. Because Ukraine has no capacity to buy weapons. Most of its arsenal, what it has now, is what it inherited from the Soviet Union. What is produced in Ukraine ends up going to the Russians. And if Ukraine went west, trust me, those industries wouldn't have a single chance, because the established European defense industries would say, thank you very much, we'll sell to you cheaper and we'll be more advanced. And if you doubt that, look at the defense industry in Poland, which was 250,000 people. It's now reduced down to 10,000. That's the way it's going to go. So, some winners and some losers. Yanukovych played a game of, yes, I think so. And then he suddenly said, no, I can't sign this now, I want to negotiate some more. When he said that, those who wanted the agreement saw a sense of betrayal. That betrayal set in motion the original demonstrations in Maidan. Legitimate demonstrations about, wait, you promised one thing and now you've got to do another. What did Yanukovych do? How did he respond? Well, police measures. Not particularly brutal ones by crowd control standards, but they were police measures. This Maidan was going to be controlled, it wasn't going to lead anywhere. And basically the history of Maidan from late November to late December is one of organized protest, but with relatively limited impact upon the government. What is Yanukovych's counteroffensive? He's visiting Beijing, and he's visiting Moscow. Between the two capitals, he ends up with $20 million in loans and credits. He also ends up with a very curious thing from Beijing. The guarantee that there would be nuclear protection for Ukraine. It's the most curious possible thing you could talk about. Ukraine was guaranteed by signatures of the Budapest Agreement back in '94 when he gave up its arsenal. Now China suddenly says, we're going to enter this, and if any nuclear power attacks Ukraine, we're going to be protecting you with our nuclear umbrella. The message was Ukraine was going to be joining Mr. Putin's Eurasian Economic Union. And from a Chinese perspective, this in fact meant if you were tilting towards Asia, you were tilting towards Beijing. And so China, which by the way has a large handle on the grain crop, it takes 10% of the grain from Ukraine, exports it. It offered to build a huge port in Crimea to essentially manage even larger scale grain exports. Was essentially backing Russia. And by the way, folks, it has continued to back Russia. All the talk we have about this being a problem with the Russians would have folded their tents up a long time ago without China, in fact, saying, no, we are supporting you. And look at the votes in the United Nations. China says it's not, no internal intervention, and then it says, yes, but we understand there are special circumstances in Ukraine. So, what the Russians have done since this has in fact said, we'll back Yanukovych. The problem was, much to their surprise, Mr. Yanukovych decided to leave. And I don't want to go into all the background of exactly what happened between the 19th and 21st of February, because it's a very complicated story with a number of different narratives by different people. The point is, Mr. Putin did not expect to have a revolution, and he responded to it very quickly by seizing the Crimea. He seized it covertly. He seized it with gentle little green men who didn't acknowledge that they belonged to the Russian military. But please note, he already had 20,000 troops in the Crimea because he has a fleet there. But he seized it without a fight. And why did he seize it? Well, Washington Quarterly, back in 2011, has a very good article by a young scholar by the name of Gaetoni, who talks about the tensions inside Crimea. Crimean Tatars not particularly happy with the dominance of the Russians there, and very fearful that they would in fact be infringed upon. And what Mr. Putin was in fact doing when Kiev was particularly weak and could not militarily act, he engaged in a coup de main, which effectively says, I'll maintain order here. Now he annexed it as well, and he annexed it and said, oh, and by the way, the offshore rights, which are about oil and gas drilling, yes, we want that. But it was largely conditioned by the context of the crisis and what he understood to be the dynamics inside the Crimea itself. That leaves the Ukrainians with the problem of they've lost sovereignty in a place, and now they have to defend it. And what followed, and what we're looking at right now, is a rising, what I call the revolt of the administrative centers. Because the first part of fighting out in Lugansk and Donetsk is symbolic. It's about taking over administrative offices. And it ends with the Ukrainians deciding to do an anti-terrorist operation. And unfortunately, the Russians being quite willing to escalate each time the anti-terrorist operation made gains, they would in fact ante up and put more into the equation. And what we had over the last few weeks militarily is a very interesting situation where the anti-terrorism operation got closer and closer to culmination, taking the two administrative centers back in Lugansk and Donetsk, but then exposing themselves because they had to concentrate manpower around large urban centers to counterstrikes by Russian forces. And that's exactly what's happened. And you now have an anti-terrorism operation which is suspended. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense just said it. Putin is proposing some sort of negotiated settlement, and our friends from Donetsk and Lugansk have come out and said, yes, what we want is federalism with our autonomy. Now, that effectively, once again, is a fundamental assault upon the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, what's Ukraine's problem? Ukraine lives in limbo between security systems. NATO is not at Wales, the summit coming up, is not going to say they're going to give military support for Ukraine. What they do euphemistically right now is say, we're going to expand our rapid reaction forces to prevent things like Ukraine. If I was a Ukrainian listening to that, I would in fact say what NATO has said is it's beyond the alliance. If individual states want to do things, that's fine and dandy. But NATO is not going to move to do anything. They may move more troops into Poland, they may move into the Baltic states, but there seems to be no will to in fact support Ukraine militarily. Now why? Well, last week, Mr. Putin went to a youth conference up around Tver. A very long, rambling speech. But there's one paragraph stands out. He said, you folks in the West, you shouldn't forget we're a nuclear power. And we'll use nuclear weapons to defend our vital interests. Please note, we started out with this post-Cold War system, one based on values. If you watch Russian propaganda over the whole time of this, it's been a declaration of two things. One, Russia's vital national interests. And then two, a running commentary on what Russian values are. Which is to say, the unifying structure of what was the post-Cold War system has been fundamentally challenged in what is the most important thing as to the stability, geopolitical stability of the system. And there does not seem to be any mechanisms that in this crisis, that can regulate it. Now, I could explain that to you because there's a whole bunch of other crises going on in all kinds of other places. And there's a major power which is tired. Would you like to guess what that major power is which is tired? It's us. Because we don't have the will to want to commit to. And I can tell you how I tell that what that commitment is, because everybody who talks about Ukraine talks about sanctions and how we're going to put more and more sanctions on. But in fact, what's happening is military power is deciding this issue, not sanctions. Sanctions are a long-term tool. But they don't change feet on the ground who's winning and losing in a battle. And that's what the Ukrainians confront. That's where they are right now. And they face very serious problems. Because the Russians have a very capable military which they have reformed. And the truth of the matter is the Ukrainians have not reformed their military. The man who's running their MOD right now is a former Ministry of Internal Affairs person. Perfect guy to run anti-terrorism operation, urban insurgency, that sort of thing. But not someone you'd want to be conducting large-scale combat operations, combined arms. The Ukrainian army is not strong in that. And the Russians can escalate technologically, as they have done again and again, to get leverage. So that's where we are right now. The political table is out. There's some sort of notion of, well, let's try Minsk, and the representatives of the two quote-unquote republics have presented their notion of a federal solution, one which Ukrainians have universally rejected as essentially compromising the integrity of the state. But Ukraine can't handle this by itself. It doesn't have the military, the economic. One of the other sides, which by the way we have to look at, is this war is costing Ukraine, and the Ukrainian economy desperately needs capital to transform itself internally. And so it's a very, very nasty trap the Ukrainians are in. And that's what I got to say, and I'm sticking to it.
Will you take a couple of questions, Dr.
Yeah,
Kipp?
sure.
What about natural gas?
Well, that's one of the Russian leverages. The Russians have leverage not only vis-a-vis Ukraine, they have leverage vis-a-vis the West Europeans. West Europeans have heavily bought into and accepted the idea that Russian natural gas was a safe supply. Ukrainians are even more dependent upon it, and I don't know what's going to happen as of cold winter months and the reserves go down. I was there in 93, and my hotel room in the Dnieper had the temperature of 55 degrees. And that was because the Ukrainians couldn't pay for natural gas. Yes?
I have a question for you. What is your definition of civil war? Because you use it as a topic here, and this is considered a Russian title for what's going on in eastern Ukraine, not Ukrainian point of view. We are not considering it as I'm Ukrainian as a civil war.
You were calling it an anti-terrorist operation. That's the official definition that Ukrainians use. And that's a legal definition which allows you to mobilize forces and use them internally without going to martial law. But you are in fact fighting people from your own, who are part of Ukraine. There may be Russians with them, but they're not all of them.
But the leaders are Russian military trained officers. Strelkov, for example.
Leaders may be, a good many of the fighters are in fact miners and steel workers. But they're,
Okay, there are drug addicted people, alcoholics, and different kind of scam people there as well fighting.
that terminology is what one ends up with when you have decided that the other guys you're not going to make peace with. Alcoholics and drug addicts do not define terrorists. You're using the word terrorist. Terrorist implies they are outside the rule of law. Okay, well, I will tell you right now that that's a problem because you've got to make peace. And a very, I would say, judicious American general with a very competent president once decided that when the war was over, you let everybody go home, and unless they've committed major crimes, you forget about it. That's mathematics. Because you have to think about what follows the war. And that's always been the problem. The anti-terrorist operation ended up being about taking 2 cities. And you can't win fighting battles in cities because you don't have the manpower to play that game. The Russians could counterattack, and what did they do? They encircled you. Right now, I've got it here. Let's see if I can find my wonderful map. This is a situation map from the Ukrainians today. I should have put these on slide. One second. This is situation combined. Those red circles, those are in fact encircled Ukrainian units. And that is a major military problem. What you were doing very well was concentrating on 2 cities, Lugansk and Donetsk. But the border was left open, 100 kilometers of it. Okay, so the Russians could move in and reinforce. Once they moved in and reinforced, you ended up with a new front opened in the south, large-scale encirclement of Ukrainian forces down here, and then up between Donetsk and the south, another major encirclement where large elements of the National Guard got trapped. Those kind of things, that kind of mobile warfare, is exactly what the problem is. And it is Russian military here. You were absolutely right.
Then if it is Russian military, then it is not civil war anymore. That's the whole point. As a follow-up,
Right.
the statesmen in the West, in Western Europe, and President Obama try to avoid the word invasion. And
incursion, that's what they're calling it.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Try to avoid the word
Right.
invasion and try to avoid the word terrorist. But those who fight in Eastern Ukraine for the money, and they admitted it, hired from the outside, like you were saying, then it is no longer civil war. And then why you think different people in Western Europe try to avoid, to dance around the word invasion and call it incursion? As an expert, what would be semantics here?
Nukes.
I could answer that one.
Nukes,
Uh-huh.
fundamentally, profoundly, nuclear weapons, which ultimately becomes back the capital in which a major military confrontation is decided. And linkage. Always remember that the NATO structure, when the Cold War was on, was that tactical nuclear weapons would, in fact, when used in Europe, would guarantee linkage between the strategic arsenal of the United States and the strategic arsenal of the Soviet Union, and guarantee the destruction of both. That was what forced to frap actually existed for.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay, now, where are we? Well, the question is Ukraine inside NATO? No, it's not. So, who would make the guarantees? Who is going to make the commitment to say, yes, it's an invasion, and now we're going to take these actions against Russia?
A piece of paper, Budapest Agreement, would make guarantees. You
Budapest
mentioned
Agreement.
Budapest Agreement, yeah.
Yeah, Budapest Agreement. Look, here's the problem. I was in Kiev in 1993, and I remember everybody in the Rada had read John Mearsheimer's article. John Mearsheimer wrote a wonderful article in International Security saying the best thing for everybody is to get nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Everyone will be happy, and he was particularly nodding towards Germany getting it. And I was there, and I had to explain to the Ukrainians that you had the wrong nuclear weapons. But the ones that you had were, in fact, in silos which were designed to hit the United States. And they wouldn't be terribly useful against Russia. And they would be very, very destabilizing in vis-a-vis relations between the United States and Ukraine. Now, I went back to the United States and I told Rose Gottmuller, who was handling it at that time, saying, look, Ukraine needs economic assistance. We've got to stabilize the place, and the issue of nukes should be secondary. I agree with them, they're getting rid of them, but the fundamental thing now is a stable Ukraine. Ultimately and finally, we did move in that direction, and there were economic guarantees given to Ukraine, assistance, etc. But it came very, very late in the game. It should have been done originally in 1992, but it wasn't. Now, is it a civil war or not? That you may argue about, but how does it end? Do you negotiate with other Ukrainians? Do you negotiate with the Russians? If I were you, I wouldn't want to negotiate with the Russians unless I had somebody else at the table with me who had some really strong cards.
And that's exactly what President Poroshenko is doing. I don't want to dominate because Leslie has questions. And
Folks,
that's exactly what Poroshenko, the president, is doing.
Folks, I want to take a moment. We're out of time. If Dr. Kipp is agreeable to sticking around and answering a few more questions, we've got the room, but I want to take a moment just to thank him for coming in. Appreciate it.
Regardless how it will end, what do you think? There are two people who generally were close to each other, a lot of intermarriage, understood each other historically, and so what will, in your sort of opinion or foresight, do to the relationship between two people on a people's level, or sort of intelligent, not necessarily pessimism, but intelligent people's level? What will it do to the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians in your whatever?
Well, I've watched the propaganda on both sides. If that model continues, the relations are going to be poisoned. I would say particularly on the Russian side, because they've created an image. I mean, everyone in Kiev is a fascist. Every one of them wants to, all sorts of points like that, and there's not much room to hope that you'll get decent relations. Yeah.
Can I ask, are you hearing things from people within NATO? I mean, are the people within the organization on sort of a unified front as far as the response to what's going on in Ukraine?
No.
And what does that reaction then range from?
Well, what was very interesting to me is I saw the first announcement of who was going to be in the Rapid Reaction Force. And I was very pleased to see the Norwegians and the Danes. And then I looked around, and the Brits were there, God bless them. But I didn't see French and I didn't see Germans. And in the Baltic, if you're really talking about security, the Germans matter, okay? Tell you a story. When the West was selling all you guys ought to have armies to go off and fight in these peacekeeping or other operations. The Latvians said, but that's not our problem. Our problem is territorial defense. We need an ability essentially to prevent Riga from being cut off from the rest of the country. And there's a geographic fact that the Russian military settlements that were built during the Cold War time surround Riga and the major highways in and out. So the Latvians needed territorial defense. You know who went in and helped them? The Swedes. They knew something about territorial defense. They thought about it in a major goddamn way. While NATO was saying, oh, send your force over to Bosnia. That's a good place. And you'll all learn to work together as a company inside a battalion. That's not the problem that the Estonians, the Latvians, and the Lithuanians have. They really need the ability to protect their governments from internal subversion. I said it. That's exactly the problem. Okay?
No, okay, Jason.
But it is. But if it comes to a fight, it'll be a civil war. That's the goddamn issue. And it's the Baltics have already suffered Russian pressure in case of a cyber attack in 2007. Mr. Putin is getting in a habit of thinking, I can do certain things and nobody's going to do anything meaningful about it. And that's a problem.
So, and you see no solution, just because you said, we are tired, like we are American society and our government, so there is no solution. There will be a just bloodish war and nobody cares.
What disturbed me particularly, The Atlantic published an article a week ago about a meeting up in Finland at Boisto, where Americans and Russians from think tanks got together and they talked about a 24-point solution to Ukraine. There were no Ukrainians invited, okay? That sounds an awful lot like Munich to me, all right? I mean, Ukraine's fate cannot be decided without Ukrainians. Okay, their government has a right to have a major voice in this. But there seems no will because of this limbo land that Ukraine lives in terms of security systems in Europe. For years, I'll put my colors on the table, one of the things which I recommended regularly was extremely close ties between the militaries of Ukraine and Poland. And there are actually some things now happening in that area which are very, very good. Because the Poles are close. They in fact understand the problem.
There was a period of PFP romance, you remember, and you were part of it.
I have to say, if there's any hope, and I don't put a lot of reliance on it, Putin's assertion about the possibility of looking for a negotiated, again, the federal compromise, and less than complete autonomy, but on the other hand, the local folks retaining control of police. And that's sort of on the table right now in Minsk and so on. And you've got to ask yourself whether Poroshenko is going to look back at his body politic and say, well, you know, I'm all in. Or maybe this seems like some kind of grounds to effect a compromise. I think that's why EU hasn't talked about going to sanctions until we're waiting a week and we're going to see how this folds out.
Right.
But Putin has ratcheted up the pressure by opening the other fronts and so on. So again, the question is whether Ukraine will go to people's war, and if it does, we've got a long, bloody contest to look forward to. And then what you start thinking about is the fall call-ups in Russia and in Ukraine.
Yeah, one of the things is that both sides are going to have their conscripts run out. They're going to retain them, or they're going to...
Or they'll call more. And that's when the Moscow bourgeoisie starts getting hit.
Well, one of the things that the Ukrainians have done, and I did not like it, and I think it's very dangerous, they've created National Guard formations largely funded by oligarchs. And there's a great problem with that, because whether those forces are actually under central state authority or autonomous. And I noted that the governor of Dnipropetrovsk suggested that if there is a threat to Zaporozhye, he's going to blow some dams. If he chooses to do that, the consequences are going to be long for a whole lot of Ukraine.
And one young guy in Ukraine said that there are also a lot of pipelines running to the Central and Western Europe and forested areas and so on. I mean, there are people
But,
of war, there are some horrible things.
very much so, unfortunately. Better answer this.
All right, I think, can we bring it to a close then? Thank you all for coming.